Continue. All right.
All right. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thanks especially to Professor Perry Link. Thanks to the History Department, the History Club, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and thanks to the Intellectual Life Fund, and great thanks to Pamela Crossan. I think Pam joined us today in the History Department for making all of these events possible with her organizational and supporting work. I want to just note to attendees as they log in, and I will try to keep in line with the waiting room, make sure that people are welcomed in a timely way. You can please raise your hand virtually by hitting the reactions tab there at the bottom of your screen, and we can unmute you to ask a live question. You can also type a question into the chat at any point, and that will be visible to Professor Link and myself. Professor Perry Link is Professor Emeritus of East Asian Studies at Princeton University and Chancellorial Chair for Teaching Across Disciplines at the University of California at Riverside, so our neighbor here in normal times. He received his BA, MA, and PhD from Harvard. He's published widely on modern Chinese language, literature, and popular thought, and is a member of the Princeton China Initiative, the Human Rights Watch in Asia, and other groups that support human rights. He's authored many books. Professor Link has asked me explicitly to be brief, so that will require briskly moving through a number of really essential volumes in the field of China studies in recent years. The Uses of Literature, Life in the Socialist Chinese Literary System, Evening Chats in Beijing, Probing China's Predicament, Two Kinds of Truth, Stories and Reportage from China by Liu Binyan, a number of books that he also co-edited and translated, including the Tiananmen Papers, The Chinese Leadership's Decision to Use Force Against Their Own People in Their Own Words by Zhang Liang. His essays include Corruption and Indignation, Windows into Popular Chinese Views of Right and Wrong, Whose Assumptions Does Xu Bing Upset and Why? And his most recent books, I just want to flag, and I'll also include these in the chat so that people can, and also in the description below, so that people can find these volumes. An Anatomy of Chinese Rhythm, Metaphor, Politics for Harvard in 2013. The Most Wanted Man in China, My Journey from Scientist to Enemy of the State, which is the memoir of Chinese astrophysicist Fang Lizhi. And also a translation of No Enemies, No Hatred, Selected Essays and Poems of Liu Xiaobo, the Chinese Nobel Peace Prize winner. And most recently, I want to note, I had the delightful experience of working with Dr. Link and Paul Pickowitz of UCSD on a volume of vignettes about China, living and working in China, called China Tripping, Encountering the Everyday in the People's Republic in 2019. Again, I'll share these titles and some more relevant information in the chat and in the information below. And in the meantime, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Professor Perry Link. Thank you very much, Perry, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeremy. Can everybody hear? Do something if you can't. Thank you for the generous introduction. And maybe we have a small enough group today to just have a seminar. Anyway, my topic is why Chinese dissidents of considerable intellectual ability are or have been supporters of Donald Trump. And I have a share screen outline that I want to put up to help you follow where my meandering thoughts are going. Can everybody see that? Does anybody not see it? Let's go through this, and I'll pause from time to time and welcome questions at midstream. I want to start with this question of, should we think of Chinese dissidents as fringe people? And I put that up as a question because that's often the way they are explicitly or implicitly referred to in the public sphere, in the media and so on. They're these very unusual people out on the fringe. And that's true in one sense, but it's very untrue in another. And I just wanted to lay that down because it undergirds everything else I want to say today. In their social position, yes, they're in the extreme. They risk being isolated, made pariahs, and even sent to prison. And to join that group, one is a tiny, tiny minority who stands on a fringe. In that sense, yes, they are very fringe. In the sense in which they're not fringe is in the way they frankly address the problems of the whole society. And those two characteristics, being socially on the fringe and intellectually in what they say, being right down the middle, are linked. It's precisely because they say exactly what they think about the heart of the matter in society that the regime puts them on the fringe. And it's exactly why most of the people who live their daily lives within the mainstream of society don't speak out, don't say exactly what they think, because they know that if they do, they will be put out on the extreme. So I just want to lay that down to sort of explain why in the latter part of my career, the last 30 years or so, I've spent a lot of time studying and writing about dissidents. It's not because I'm preoccupied with the fringe. It's precisely the opposite, that I'm preoccupied with the core of things. And these people are the ones who, frankly, tell about the core. Their fundamental values I have here in a line, for the most part, are things that you and I and most American academics, liberals, and so on would be in favor of, are in favor of. Truth, justice, decency, sympathy with underdogs. Now, I don't want to apotheosize dissidents. Do they include stubborn people and rivalries? By all means. In fact, I would make the argument that Chinese dissidents are more likely, much more likely, to be stubborn and even what one might say egotistical because of who they are. It takes, think of it this way, it takes a very strong-minded, not to say stubborn person to risk so much in life in order to stand out and tell the truth come hell or high water. That's what what should I say, filters the Chinese populace, if you will, to find the ones who are especially stubborn that play this role. Do they have rivalries? Yes, and these rivalries appear when they move overseas, even more than when they're in China. In China, they have a kind of forced unity because they're all opposed to the excesses of the regime, and that big cloud of the regime that's over them almost induces them all to agree with each other and to cooperate with each other. But when they're out and that big gray cloud goes away, they all are in the habit of thinking, I'm right, I'm strong, I'm stubborn, I ought to be in charge. And when there's no external force to oblige them to agree, as there is inside China, they are very rivalrous, not to say nasty with each other. Sometimes, let's not take that to an extreme either. But I want to come to my main theme today. Why would this group of people support Trump? And I'm not going to say they all do, they don't, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But more than half do, and certainly a lot more than I originally estimated do. I was surprised to find how many were Ting Chuanda, as they say, Trump boosters. Now, I have a couple of reasons why this might be so, and I tip my hand on the answers no, no, and yes. You can see here in my outline, and another yes. Is it because of Trump's personal characteristics? His arrogance, his bullying, his lying, his sexual predation. You think of something like that Billy Bush and the Access Hollywood tape where he's boasting that he can grab any woman in the crotch that he likes and they let him get away with it because he's famous and so on. I don't have to go on with you about the ugly aspects of this person, you know them as well as I do. But I have here in parentheses, what else is new? Because to many Chinese dissidents, yeah, Trump is all of those things, but what do you expect in a politician? Because theirs are at least as Trumpian as Trump himself. The only difference in China, well, not the only, but a main difference is that there's no free press to report on these things and to nail down what's actually happening. But it's very common for power holders in China to be arrogant and to lie and to bully and to take sexual advantage and so on. So that's not the reason why Chinese dissidents support Trump. Is it because of his political values, his political style? And I have here, no. Here, it's easy to draw parallels between Trump and Xi Jinping, for example. And Chinese dissidents see that as well as you and I can if we think that both of them want to be president of everything. Xi has made it. Trump failed, but he was trying for that. President for life. Again, so far, Xi looks as if he's succeeded, whereas Trump tried, you remember, and didn't work for him. They see their opponents as enemies of the people and use this idea of the people to be their backing, real or imaginary, and anybody who opposes me is an enemy of the people. Both of them have used that phrase. And do they prefer yes men? Yeah, they do. We can see how people who spoke the truth to Trump one way or another, all the way up to Mike Pence, get turned against eventually because he wants around him, does Trump, only ones who will agree that Trump is great. But the same is true of Xi Jinping. The difference being that for Xi, it has lasted and it works. But one of the problems of trying to get a hunk of truth through to Xi Jinping in China is precisely because the people around him are this sort of moat of yes men, yes people. Okay, so it's not for those two reasons that Chinese dissidents support Trump. Is it for his China policy? And here I have yes. And here I want to underline yes. I think this is the main reason. The US policy towards China, of course, is the aspect of US government that China dissidents pay most attention to. Why? Because it concerns their country. It's the most relevant thing. So what has US China policy been toward China ever since the opening back in the 1970s? In their view, and pretty much in mine too, it's been accommodationist. It's letting the Communist Party of China have its way, indeed helping it by doing investment, by bringing it into the WTO, by not confronting it on human rights. You remember right after the Tiananmen massacre, H.W. Bush sent a secret delegation to Deng Xiaoping to say, we want to keep our guanxi, our relation with you, all the way through to the about face that Clinton made in 1994 on human rights. And when Obama came in, the first thing he said was that we're not going to let human rights get in the way of important other issues we need to work on, like trade and environment and so on. So from the point of view of a Chinese dissident, US-China policy has been pretty terrible ever since the 1970s. Lo and behold, when Mr. Trump comes along, he has some prominent advisors, and I here have listed Miles Yu Maochun and Matt Pottinger. Those are the two most important ones in my view. And I don't really know how this happened, how Trump had the luck or whatever it was that got him to bring in some China advisors who were not like those previous 4 or 5 decades of China advisors. And the Trump State Department was very good on this point, I have to say, distinguishing the CCP from China, quote unquote, that is from the Chinese people. Always before, and even now, you see very commonly phrases like China's position at the UN or China's wishes for navigating the Arctic or China this, China that, where what's really meant is the top level of the Communist Party leadership. It has nothing to do with China as a whole. China finds the Dalai Lama repulsive. You'll see lines like that. But imagine a Was I muted there?
Just for a minute. Sorry about that, Perry. Yeah, that
Oh,
was
that's
my,
all right. I was afraid I'd have to repeat the whole thing from the beginning, no?
you're all set. No, just about 10 seconds.
Okay, so we're back on the rails here. The advisors like Yu Mao-chun in the State Department and Matt Pottinger in the White House National Security Staff made that distinction very clearly, that we can talk about and with and for the Chinese people without saying that that's equivalent to talking with the top leadership of the Communist Party of China. An extremely important distinction. And then I have this line, seeing the CCP for what it is. If it's not a synonym for all of China, what is it? Well, it's a political party that's grabbed power and puts its own extension of power as the very top priority, and has done that ever since the 1930s. It's just that outward conditions have changed along the way. To see the CCP for what it is another very important innovation that the Trump administration brought in. Now, I'm not crediting Trump personally for this. And as I said a moment ago, I'm not quite sure how these better China advisors got in, but they certainly did make a difference. And if you compare them, for example, to the China advisors that have been in place ever since the 70s, you will note that Yu Mao-chun is the very first Chinese American on the whole list. There's a group of 20 or more that we could make. They are all second language learners who might or might not know Chinese very well. Matt Pottinger is a second language learner, but I'll go out on a limb here. I think his Chinese is considerably better than any of the previous China advisors ever since the 1970s. When my friend Mike Oxenberg helped to set up relations under the Carter administration, Michael Oxenberg is a very smart guy, no question about it. And I liked him personally, but he didn't know Chinese. He could not get into the Chinese world by speaking Chinese and feeling what it feels like the way Pottinger can. And even more the way Miles Liu can. He's born and raised in Sichuan. So this is a big reason why Chinese dissidents have been favorable toward the Trump administration. There's another set of reasons here that I'm calling for being an alternative to the Democrats. Feeling really is a better word than arguing, that the Democrat Party in the US is drifting too close to the style of Mao in, for example, using tactics of moral intimidation. You have to agree with us about X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, you have to account for yourself. I was listening just a couple of days ago to an interview with Li Nanyang, who is the daughter of Li Rui, who was once a secretary to Mao Zedong, but later turned to be a liberal. And in his later years, he was a very outspoken Chinese liberal. His daughter has been in the West a long time, and she is a very typical, strong Trump supporter among overseas Chinese. And I saw an interview with her where she was complaining, and this was one of her examples, about the phrase Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And she was making the point of the moral intimidation that gets thrust upon people. You have to say Black Lives Matter. And most of us would want to say that. I hope all of us would. But she wanted to say all lives matter, and then is attacked because by saying all lives matter, she's attacked for not saying Black Lives Matter. So it becomes a narrow sort of formulaic expression that one is obliged to come out with, even though and answer morally if you don't. Her argument was, I say all lives matter, and I believe that, and that includes Black Lives Matter. And I don't want people to come and tell me that I'm a racist because I say that everybody's life matters. We can talk about this later. It's a subtle question, but this moral intimidation, you have to agree with this or else, is one thing that the overseas dissidents really rail against. Another is the limits on free speech. Now, this isn't the US government doing this so much as big tech, as it's called, the Twitter and Facebook, monitoring words and keeping people off of Twitter because they're saying the wrong thing, they're going too far, or it's hate speech or something like that. Now, a key point to make here, and they make it and I make it too because I believe it, the point here in limiting free speech is not to say that hateful, nasty speech is good. No, by no means. The point is, if you're going to say that some speech is okay and other speech is not okay, you have to hand to somebody the right to decide what other people shouldn't say. So the key here, to whom do you give the power to decide, is the point that worries them most. Because in their society, they've seen, you hand this power over to the Communist Party of China, and they will rule out pornography and other hate speech, yes, but they'll also use that power to rule out whatever they want to do. So it becomes the key question to say, how can you hand that power to any human being? If God were available to play that function, then fine, but God keeps his silence. So what human being deserves that power? And a third reason here, now this is still under the category of being too close to the Democrats. A lot of the overseas dissidents see the Democrats as too close to Blacks and Hispanics and see that as unfair to Asians and whites. And a very prominent way that this comes up, and I'm sure you've noticed it in the news, is that the Asians are very good at getting grades in high school and SAT scores are high, but they don't get into Stanford and Harvard because, or some of them don't, because the places are taken for affirmative action kinds of reasons. And they think this is fundamentally unfair and it violates the American principle of equality and level playing field and so on. I personally don't agree with that argument so much, and in fact, at all. And we can discuss that later, but I want to put it on the list because that is one reason that they find the Democrats objectionable. I have a little section on why do some dissidents oppose Trump. I said at the beginning a moment ago that most, a surprising proportion, in fact, more than half, support Trump, but some don't, and some are very vocal in opposing Trump. And I wanted to review the reasons they use. One is that we should oppose lying and tyrannical style bullying and so on principle. We object to it in Xi Jinping. We object to it in Trump. We should object to it anywhere. A model of a democracy and a healthy society should unequivocally, unexceptionally support that principle and not trade it for something else. Don't use it as an excuse for something else. Now, what they mean by that, don't say that, yeah, we'll put up with Trump's bullying and lying because he has a State Department that sees the Communist Party accurately. That trade-off idea rankles some of them. They say this principle needs to be absolute. Another argument they use is that Trumpism hurts the image of American democracy in the whole world, and that's a loss both to America and to the whole world. You know, we've all heard these sayings about the shining city on the hill or the Statue of Liberty lifting her lamp to the tired and the poor. That's a very valuable, attractive ideal of American democracy. in many places around the world. And when you tolerate a Trump, you're trashing that ideal. And then a third is that the Trump boosters, the ones they argue with, go way too far in supporting Trump. That is, we, the ones who oppose Trump, might agree with you that he's put some good people in the State Department and he's made a good turn toward the China policy, And you can support him for that. But when you go on to support him by embracing the crazy conspiracy theories, then you've lost your way and you've lost your focus on China. You're starting to jump into American politics and into a very weird branch of American politics. I must say it's disappointed me to find how many friends who are in the support Trump group get obsessed by the question of, was the election stolen? And were the people who went to the Capitol on January 6th maybe Antifa provocateurs, these weird theories? They just go too far in following the whole pro-Trump line in the US, when they should be, according to the ones who oppose Trump, they should maintain their focus on the China relevant issues. Let's see how I'm doing for time here. I guess I can get through this. Why don't we, unless somebody has an immediate question. How should American liberals like me, like I think probably most of you, view the pro-Trump dissidents? And I thought here of 4 mistakes that I want to flag, and then 6 questions I would have. 4 reasons why that would be wrong for saying we should reject their views are that they are poorly informed. They're not poorly informed. These are elite intellectuals who are smart enough inside China to jump the firewall, who can read the Washington Post and the New York Times and everything as well as you and I can, and who do and are very well informed. That argument goes nowhere. Number 2, are they politically naive and need our tutelage? I've seen quite a few examples of this, of Chinese people who speak in a support Trump manner, and a Westerner answers them in a condescending way, saying, oh, we understand that you grew up in an authoritarian society and you've had this groupthink inculcated into your style of thought, and you need to be able to break out of it, and we're here to help you, and so on. That is a mistake. These people that come out of the cauldron of Chinese politics, who have been so brave as to be dissidents, have much richer political experience on the whole than the well-meaning liberals overseas who presume to tell them what they really should be thinking. So that question of who should be learning from whom, I'll get to in a moment, but that's an open question in my view. We mustn't assume that we're the ones in the position to be tutors. This next bad reason for, a wrong reason to take a view on pro-Trumpism is simply a misreading, I think, but I've heard it several times. Don't use this principle of the enemy of my enemy is automatically my friend. That's a shabby principle. And I can see on the surface why that would make sense, because the dissidents are opposed to Xi Jinping. Trump comes along, he's opposed to Xi Jinping, so the enemy of my enemy is automatically my friend. But the reason that's a dead end in our thinking is that that's not the way the dissidents choose to support Trump's policies. It's because of his changing China policy up here. That's the main reason. And they're not doing it because they see that, oh, he's just the enemy of my enemy. And finally, anyone who agrees with Trump's China advisors approves of everything about Trump. This is a very important one because I've seen this many times. People will say, oh, you support Trump. That means you must be in favor of men walking off buses and grabbing women's crotches. That must mean that you're in favor of a leader who blusters and lies. No, it doesn't mean that. This is a kind of guilt by association reading that is quite unfair to the pro-Trump China dissidents. They have their reasons, and you can't say that they're in favor of everything about Trump just because they feel so strongly about the importance of a different China policy. Can I scroll down here? How do I scroll down? Do 6 questions. Jeremy? Hey,
Yeah, are you, can you still control the share screen?
My battery might be low. Let me lick it. So
oh, your mouse?
My mouse, yeah. There it is, okay. Let me go to the 6 questions I have. One I've just touched on. Do we qualify as tutors? That is, when we see someone, a Chinese dissident who has this very, to us, odd view of, I would support Trump. Are we in the position of tutor? Are we assuming a top position? And it raises the question of whose experience is definitive. I won't go into that more because I just did, right? These people who come out of the cauldron of Chinese politics have their own backgrounds that in some ways are things we don't know about. So the question of who defines the superior position ought to be open, in my view. Question 2, are we using double standards? You hear this not so much among carefully thinking people, but I think it's a popular view in our society to think, oh, those people are different. Chinese culture is different. So if they're, experiencing some terrible things, maybe that's in their culture. That, in my view, and in theirs, these dissidents' views, is using a double standard. You need to use the same measurement of pain and suffering for all people. 1992, when the Cold War was over, the West heaved a big sigh saying, now we have the end of history, the Cold War is over. And to the Chinese dissidents, that felt like a double standard because you still had China and North Korea and Vietnam and Cuba under these Marxist-Leninist states. Where was the Cold War over unless you're using a double standard, unless you're saying implicitly that the experience of Eastern Europe and Russia is definitive of the beginning and end of the Cold War, is in itself more important. Another common attitude that rankles the Chinese dissidents is this notion of China and the US both have their problems. Yes, China is suppressing the Uyghurs terribly, but the US had racism. Yes, China this, but China that, but the US that. And this extends even to saying that that Trump and Xi Jinping are cut of the same cloth. They're the same kind of thing. So we each have our troubles, go away. But the point that they would make, and I support this point, is you have to look at the contexts that Trump and Xi are in. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that Donald Trump and Xi Jinping in their political impulses are identical. Now that's probably not, that's not true literally, but they're pretty close, all right? So what makes the difference between the result that we see in China and the result that we see in the US? It's the contexts. When Trump goes out and wants to have his way in Xinjiang, have his way in Hong Kong, have his way against human rights lawyer, he gets his way. When Xi goes out, I'm sorry, when Xi goes out, he gets his way. When Trump does, he runs into barriers. In our country, he ran into the courts when he tried to put through his first anti-immigration decrees. He runs into opposition in Congress. He certainly runs into opposition in the free press. He runs into opposition when people take to the streets and demonstrate. All of those checks on Trump power aren't there for Xi. Xi has to worry about rivalry among his mafia group at the top who might undercut him, yes, but out in society, there aren't those checks. So that's what we mean by contexts. The context in one case is a break on the autocrat's actions, and in another case, it's not. There's a huge difference there. We might compare here the January 6th assault on the Capitol with what's going on in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. We probably don't notice, but on that very day, January 6th, the 53 activists in Hong Kong, the 53 most prominent Democrats in Hong Kong, were rounded up, arrested, and sent to jail, and are now 47 of them are still on trial. That happened on 1/6. Why is this, our experience of 1/6, so huge? And barely we even notice what happened in Hong Kong. Well, partly because we're Americans, it's our country, and that makes sense. But also because the contexts are different. We just don't notice the difference in context. Think, for example, on 1/6, when the Congress people were driven out and scared under their desks and so on. Still, they came back that very evening at 7 o'clock and were able to carry out their business. A huge difference in context from something that happens in Hong Kong. Those 47 in Hong Kong are still in prison. They couldn't come back. They have no chance of coming back. Or you think of the Great Massacre in June 4th of 1989 in China, which of course was a bigger deal physically than the assault on 1/6. But we can make a parallel question here. If the Congress people were able to come back and finish their business within about 6 or 8 hours, the result of the massacre in Beijing in 1989, you could argue, is still with us today. The overall intimidation of the populace from doing explicit political demonstrations reigns today. So there are big differences here, even though this statement of China and the US both have their problems is true at a very superficial level. The differences in the scope and the duration, the severity, and the pushback against those problems is extremely different. I've added this question: are the double standards possibly racist? I'll leave this for discussion. Of course, it's an impossible question to answer, but some of the Chinese dissidents who are pro-Trump, and even ones who are not pro-Trump, do feel that. Why was the Cold War over when it was over in Europe, but nobody noticed that it was still in place in other parts of the world? Is there a level at which the Western world cares more, to put it bluntly, about white people? If white people are having a terrible Holocaust or something, that really matters. And if Asians are having it, well, they're a different culture. That's a different situation, going back to those people are different. Do the dissidents perhaps see farther than we do? Are we perhaps the ones with blinders? This is the real nub of what I want to ask you today. Do Chinese Trump boosters have a point in comparing US wokeness to Chinese Maoism? Now, on the surface, all of you, me too, are going to want to say, no, those are two very different things. But let's look at why they think there is a similarity. It's this attitude, I touched on this a moment ago, of you have to agree with us or else. Frankly, I remember feeling that shortly when was this? This was during the fall, in the fallout from the demonstrations against the the murder in Minneapolis, when on our campus at Riverside, a Black Lives Matter group, which was really very broad, it wasn't just Black students, came to our department with a letter, in very extreme terms, I might say. We need to denounce everything that's going on everywhere, including our campus, and we need to defund the campus police, and all of this brought to our department with the attitude that you have to sign on to this or else you're racist. And even though somebody like me, who's a dyed-in-the-wool anti-racist, heck, I was in demonstrations in the 1970s getting blood on my jacket for the civil rights movement, I agreed with a lot of what was in their letter, but I did recoil against the notion that you're telling me I have to sign what you wrote or else, without inviting my intellect to be part of the discussion. So that attitude reminds Chinese dissidents of the Cultural Revolution. Examine your inner thoughts. Mao Zedong said, 灵魂深处干革命. You look into the depths of your soul to do revolution. So if you don't quite agree with us on the surface, the problem is deep inside you. You have to dig in. And then when you find that you really are wrong in some way, you confess, and you earn leniency from us by confessing. These kinds of attitudes, of course, you and I wouldn't see them in our context, but these Chinese dissidents who remember the Cultural Revolution and were so frightened by these kinds of attitudes that when they see a ghost of those things coming up, they're frightened again. And for us, for our society. So I ask here in this last line, are they ducks who are first to sense the river's warmth in spring? This line comes from a poem by the famous Song poet Su Dongbo, 春江水暖鸭先知. In the springtime, when the river starts to warm up, the ducks are first to know. That's what the pro-Trump Chinese dissidents feel when they see our society going in these agree with us or else and examine your thoughts if you don't agree way. They feel the water is warming, and wouldn't it be awful if we were headed in that same direction that they were in the Maoist era? How much time do I have left here? This point about, is party loyalty smart? This is directed at us. I won't go into this in detail, but just tell you why I put it there. It's that starting about 30 years ago, when I was first writing pro-dissident articles and supporting Liu Binyan and later Su Xiaokang and Fang Lizhi and those, I had an odd experience on the American political spectrum. The New York Review of Books was with me from the very beginning. In fact, Bob Silvers, the editor, way back in 1989, when he came to Beijing and asked me to introduce him to Fang Lizhi, and I did, he just locked on to the idea that these dissidents are great and Perry Link is great for helping them. So we're going to ask him to write more articles. The reason I started writing, and have written so many articles in the New York Review, really has to do with their support of my pro-dissident attitude. So here you have a strong endorsement from the American left. On the other hand, the next people to approach me were the American Enterprise Institute, who had a whole series of talks on what if de Tocqueville went to China today, what would he say? And I got involved with them, and I wrote several articles with the American Enterprise Institute. And it dawned on me that, hey, the pretty far left and the pretty far right both agree with what I'm doing, and for the same reasons. but it's sort of the mushy middle, I call it, that didn't. And here I would put most of those China advisors of Clinton and both Bushes and Obama, who didn't see the CCP clearly and were willing to make all kinds of mushy middle kinds of compromises, who didn't like what I wrote. You know, I've been to the American Enterprise Institute a lot. I write for the New York Review of Books. I've never been to the Brookings Institute, which a lot of my friends have been to, because they, I think, don't like somebody who's strong on human rights. Okay, I end here with my personal view about all of this stuff, especially the question of the two kinds of Chinese dissident friends I have. And I have very good friends on both sides of this divide who are Trump supporters or Trump critics. And my biggest wish is that they would not struggle with each other over these things. Sometimes they get into big fights over the question of, was the election stolen? Which I think is a big waste of their energy. Their common struggle ought to be to make China better and to focus on the problem of Xi Jinping and the CCP together, because they all very much still agree about that. That's where I wish they would spend their time more. But I will stop here. I've used 45 minutes or so. And welcome your questions or comments or whatever.
Thank you very much, Perry. That gave us a lot to think about. I've got a lot of notes here, and I hope folks who are joining us will go ahead and either raise their hand using the reaction button, and we can unmute you, or you can type notes into the chat if you have any questions. And I see already that Kenneth early on asked, when you mentioned this term fringe or marginalized, who is defining the fringe? Is that the government or is that the students? Sort of who defines, from your very early in your comments,
Right.
just a few minutes in. And then he also asked separately, what would be the answers if you asked these questions of Americans? And this again goes back to the questions you were asking, the question you were posing early in. But first, yes, how do you, can you see that chat message, or did that get just sent to me?
Well, I heard you say it. That's good
Okay.
enough. Let me see. No, I don't have to read it. I heard what you said.
Okay.
Who defines the fringe? I think a lot of people, everybody. I don't think that's a controversial position. The government in China explicitly says that these people are 一小撮, a tiny group, meaning a fringe group, meaning not the mainstream. The Western press also refers to them as, I think the word dissident itself, as used in English, implies out of the mainstream, not going along with the mainstream. And commonly they're thought of that way. But I say everybody because I think they themselves view themselves as a fringe. They know that if they're going to step out and tell the truth as they see it, that they're going to be relieved of their job, or their kids will be not allowed to go to their local school. They'll pay a price, and they will be a fringe, a minority, even in families. That's true. It's a common problem among dissidents that when they decide to speak out, their family is the first one to scold them, saying, "You jerk, don't you know what that's going to do to you and to us?" And sometimes they hold back precisely in order to protect their family. So whether it's they themselves or the government that they oppose or the common press in between, I think everybody agrees that they're, if by fringe we mean unusual, not in the mainstream, that's a very common view, and it's a correct view.
Thanks, Perry.
What was the other question? Or
it was about what would be the answers if you ask these questions of Americans, and this goes back to the questions that you were asking just about 10 minutes into your remarks, so very early on, the set of questions.
oh gee, does the questioner have a specific question
Yeah,
he or he would like an answer to? Because I mean,
Kenneth, if you'd like to, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you'd like to unmute, I can do that.
Yeah, unmute, go ahead. These 6 questions? Yeah, that's too big. I can't answer all of that at once. Where's Kenneth? Why doesn't he?
There we go.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, what I would think, Perry, as I was going through that you're basically looking at the Democrat and Republican and in that mushy middle in between. And I think my question would be to you is, where is America now stance? It is no longer against Trump. He's now no longer out. Where are we in our view of dissonance and of what we're doing with the CCP in America? And good question. I don't think you can answer that.
Well, it's a complex question.
Yeah.
We could talk about the Biden administration and its advisors at one top extreme, all the way down to popular attitudes on the street. And as you know, there's changes and uncertainties and worries at all of those levels. At the Biden advisor level, so far, I think the talk has been pretty good. It's been pretty much a continuation of what the good part of the Trump policies put out there. I remember as soon as the handover happened, Tony Blinken was asked on one of the news programs if he viewed Xinjiang as a genocide, which just literally the day before stepping down, Mike Pompeo had declared. And Blinken said, yes, it's a genocide. So that's an example of a strong continuity, at least at the rhetorical level. But the jury's still out on what the Biden administration's policies towards the CCP will be in actions. Frankly, one of my biggest worries in that regard is the environment policy, where what's his name is put in charge of negotiating the environment. Remind me, Jeremy, who am I thinking of?
Kerry?
Yeah, John Kerry. John Kerry, of course, negotiated the Iran deal, and now he's going to be the point man for negotiating with the CCP about global climate. I'm afraid that the CCP will say, yes, we will cooperate with you if you will cooperate with us. And what they will want cooperation on are things like Hong Kong and Taiwan and the South China Sea and political things. And that Kerry will be forced, tempted, maybe even forced to make political concessions in return for environmental concessions. That would be unfortunate because it takes the question of the environment and makes the US side the one who is responsible for it. You guys are going to have to make the concession in to us in order to get what you want. When ideally, I think you'll agree with me that the globe belongs to everybody. And if we're negotiating about global warming, there shouldn't be somebody with the holding the bag and the other one with the upper hand. Everybody ought to be on the same page. I also am afraid that John Kerry is a sweet man and a kind-hearted man, and I'm afraid he will trade environmental concessions on the US side in return for promises on the CCP side. And I think that would be a mistake, because the CCP, I think, demonstrably has shown that its long-term promises aren't worth the paper they're written on. If you look at Hong Kong, you have the clearest example of that. So I've already sent this advice through Bill McKibben. He says he knows Kerry, saying, if you negotiate with the Chinese about reducing carbon emissions, be sure that you trade actualities for actualities. Don't trade actualities for promises. So that would be my worry. And that's why I say at that Biden level, the jury's still out. I'm not sure what'll happen there. At the popular level, you've probably seen, as I have in the last 3 or 4 days, there've been a number of Pew Research surveys and others. There've been 3 or 4 that have shown that the image of China has nosedived in the US and other Western societies. By nosedived, I mean a favorable impression of 40-something% goes down to 20 or something percent, but that's still pretty abrupt. I have 2 worries about that. One is that I don't like those surveys when they say, what is your impression of China? Is it going up or down? Because this complicates what I was trying to distinguish before between the Chinese Communist Party as a regime and the Chinese people as a people. If the Pew asked me, has my view of China gone up or down in the last 2 months, I'd have to say it's pretty much stayed the same, because when I think of China, I think of language and people and literature and history and art and poetry and good food and most of my friends and my wife. All of this is China to me. So what the governments do in dueling with each other doesn't affect my view of what I think of China. But that's not true for many of the people who answer those surveys. I think what the survey elicits are answers to, what do I think of the Chinese government and how it's behaving? So I don't like the surveys, and that's one point. The other big worry I have about the popular level, and I'm sure you've noticed this too, the popular level of US reaction to China has been the cases we've seen of anti-Asian violence against Asian Americans of all kinds in our country. You know, guys being stabbed in the back on the street in San Francisco because they look Asian and stuff. When I first saw that, I thought, oh, that's just going to be a blip. How can that be a main trend? But in the last few days, looking at the press and surveys, it seems it really is a trend, that because COVID is said to have arrived, it arose in Wuhan. I don't think any thinking person doubts that. But at a popular level, it's therefore thought of as China's fault. And therefore, Chinese Americans or Korean Americans or Indian Americans get scapegoated and get mistreated on the street. That's a big worry too. So I didn't answer your question. You're right. Your question is too big to answer completely. But looking at the top level in the Biden administration and way down at the popular level, where you have this racism raising its head, those are 2 aspects that I've noticed.
Thanks, Perry, and anyone else can jump in. I wanted to ask a quick question because you touched on this in your article, and that is the economic dimensions and sort of perception and reality in the economic dimensions, where there are certain policies in terms of tariffs that have been seen as punishing China. I think there's some disagreement as to whether they were more harmful to, for example, American farmers or the Chinese economy in terms of the previous administration. But there's also, I think, a kind of willingness to not antagonize China economically, not just at the state-to-state relationship, but individuals and large corporations. For example, our neighbors here in Hollywood. Somebody mentioned to me at one point I heard there are no more good baseball movies because they won't play in China. And so this sort of calculus of what goes into a big budget film is whether or not it's going to play well in China. And there seems to be a kind of reluctance to an anxiety to do things that might rock the boat economically, not just at the corporate level, but also at the individual, and then buying from big box stores where a vast majority of the materials are being made in China. How does that play into this, the sort of big economic side of things, perception, reality, and critiquing one regime or the other when economic policy is it covers such a diverse array of such a diverse spectrum of society?
Well, that again is a question that's way too big to answer in any detail. So let me take a couple of stabs at it. When Trump put in the tariffs, I feel, I don't study economics in our country that carefully, but my impression is that he did that with an America First principle that was trying to protect, or at least appear to protect, the middle class industrial jobs in our mid country and our farmers in the West, who whose jobs were being taken away in the first instance and whose products were not selling that well in China in the other. So he acted, in my view, without any political sense of I'm opposing a tyrannical government or I'm trying to indirectly help Uyghurs or human rights lawyers. But when he did it, a lot of Chinese dissidents rallied to the cause simply because it was an American president standing up to the CCP for the first time in their memories. And it's almost an oversimplification, but it's almost that opposing on any grounds at all is a good sign because it's opposition. Here we verge on the argument that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But Trump did that economic policy not for political reasons so much as economic, in my view. And it got viewed among dissidents as partly for political reasons. And it may have been the seed of their support for him, although I'll still argue that the main reason for their support of him is the State Department and the National Security Committee's new China policies. But the other bigger part of your question has to do with the rest of society, Hollywood industry, and so on, accommodating to the Chinese market for its own reasons. I'm sure that's true. I'm not sure what to say about play into. My personal view is not to object to that. I think if Hollywood wants to make fewer baseball movies because the market overall won't be as good because China is such a big part of the market, okay, that's a economic decision for you guys to make the call on if you want to. Where I do object to what Hollywood does, I'm trying to think of the young man who gave a talk at USC the other day on this very topic, is where the political arrangements in films are altered in order to suit the Chinese market. That certain parts are taken out or certain kinds of films aren't even made because, not because there's no market in China, but because Hollywood is afraid that the Chinese regime will clamp down on their films for political reasons. That's a kind of self-censorship that exists in scholarship too, in our academic world, and in not so much in journalism, but in business. That I think is objectionable, and we ought to look at it more carefully.
Thanks, Perry. I'll see if anyone else wants to jump into the conversation. I was really interested in this Baizuo, the sort of white leftist, the so-called politically correct line, and we've discussed that, the Weiwei politically correct idea. And I think that this maybe to some extent the very successful framing of that term by the conservative establishment here to say that this is this enormously popular thing. You do mention you mentioned the incidents on the UC Riverside campus, and I wonder I understand that there is a sort of what I would call a significant voice that is amplified on that front. But I also want to note that the sort of interesting case of the Asian Americans who are frustrated with admission policies in elite institutions. I think it's sort of striking that a lot of their champions and their lawyers and their political champions are arch conservatives. I would even say sort of reactionaries in terms of being either, sort of implicitly or explicitly racist. And I think that there's a concern to me that there's a lot of noise about affirmative action when there's no conversation about legacy seats, which are really considerable kind of affirmative action policies, right? So why a legacy seat or a sort of family member of an attendee of an institution is not being sort of flagged by these same groups, because of course they're largely white, powerful, wealthy, parents donated a building and that kind of thing, which is a form of affirmative action, and also a kind of I think that the net result there is a very successful divide and conquer policy of a very conservative, I would say, reactionary establishment. And so I think the where the conversation takes place, where that sort of Overton window is shifted, is into a dangerous place of sort of atomization of marginalized groups. Anyway, I don't know if that plays into your or if that has anything, but I think it also has to do with the sort of condescending tone that you noted on the part of a lot of people who are so struck by the way this conversation takes place. The kind of the white liberal, this sort of scandalized white liberal who learns about Latinos for Trump. It's how is that possible? And I think that kind of insistence on a sort of good behaved elector is problematic, and is a kind of result of an old colonial kind of mindset. And I think anyway, more of a comment than a question, but I really appreciated you pointing that out. The sort of expected behavior.
I think I know what you mean by encrusted white establishment speaking out for Asians who are not allowed into Stanford and Harvard because of affirmative action, and having their voice indirectly really being that they don't like affirmative action to start with. And they're sort of using the Asian example in order to get at that point. I think there's something to that.
Yeah, it's sort of alliances of convenience, and you sort of think who's benefiting from these and in what way.
I think, though, for example, William McGurn, who writes for the Wall Street Journal, who wrote an article on that point about, 10 days ago, I saw it, saying that, look, Harvard is being unfair by not letting in the Asians. There's this lawsuit, and let's hope it wins. McGurn, in his real life, has 2 adopted daughters from China. So they're English speakers. They grew up as Americans, but they are Asian ethnically. And it raises an interesting question. I mean, I don't mean to focus everything on McGurn, but part of him, I'm sure, is sincere when he's saying my daughters oughtn't to be penalized because they look Asian when they apply to Stanford. But on the other hand, his basic argument, his basic stance from that part of the Wall Street Journal is what you would call conservative in general. Affirmative action is wrong in general.
And I think there's a case. Yeah, I'm always struck by the sort of thundering silence of legacy seats in this conversation about affirmative action. It's always astounding to me. Anywhere from 5 to 30% of some of these elite institutions are legacies, legacy acceptance, and obviously you're not a shoo-in, but they do ask that on the application, and it's pretty clear, I think, on the admissions board who's paying for the new library, and I think that's affirmative action, and in its more traditional sense. More palatable sense for most people.
We got any more questions on China? Speak up, somebody. Let's just unmute and talk here. We've got a group we could have. There's Josh Goldstein. How are you, Josh?
Everybody's allowed to unmute.
Hey, hi Perry.
Hi, Josh.
Sure. I guess I have a kind of question. I mean, you talked about how a lot of folks you know who lived through the Cultural Revolution, when they see Black Lives Matter or other forms of leftism in the US, that is sort of like, you need to stand with us. There's no bystanding. You need to be an upstander. You're either with us or you're basically supporting the status quo, which is systematically against us. And that they hear echoes of the Cultural Revolution there. And I understand that experiential echo. But I guess I'm from an analytical point of view, I guess I wonder why what's up with that, because during the Cultural Revolution, the force behind that social movement was an all-powerful state.
Right.
Behind the Black Lives Matter movement is a bunch of people in the street, and certainly not the government. So I guess that's where I start to see the metaphor, the comparison really break down.
Yeah, right. No, I agree with you. I agree with you. The effect on the psychology of the person who's being presented with what I call moral blackmail is the same in the two cases, or pretty similar, but the source of the pressure is radically different. That's a very important point. We call it self-censorship. In both cases, you can have self-censorship. You clearly do. But in one case, it's the fear that the regime, with all of its tools of power, can punish you, keep your kids out of the local school or whatever. And in the other case, it's peer pressure, pretty strong, but still it comes from your peers. It doesn't come from Party Central.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Thanks.
You're at the USC now, Josh?
I am still at USC. Yes.
Good. Yeah, good.
Hey, how you doing, Jeremy? Thanks.
Nice to see you virtually, Josh.
Thank you for your talk. I'm sorry I jumped in a little late, but it's a teaching day. But I wanted to catch as much as I could.
There's a seminar at 4:00 this afternoon at USC about does fiction matter in China. I'm going to listen to that.
Oh wow, yeah,
should be good.
Thanks, Perry. King To-young has his hand raised.
Okay, King, where are you?
Hello, Perry.
Hi.
I'd like to know just a little bit about the Chinese dissidents, their view on other foreign leaders, like from the European side, because oftentimes the Chinese government was blaming, these dissidents are aligning with the foreign power. So what are their sort of view on these other kinds of leaders? Just wondering.
European leaders. You mean France, Germany? Do you mean now?
Yes, right, especially France, Germany, or Johnson,
Yeah. France has had an up and down experience in the view of the dissidents, because after the Tiananmen massacre, France led the way among Western countries in trying to rescue victims. And a lot of them went from Hong Kong one way or another to Paris, and were in Paris through that summer of 1989. And France was a hero in place. Then, I can't name exactly when the French government decided to make concessions on human rights in return for huge contracts. Which French leader was it that did that? I have to
maybe Sarkozy.
Yeah, Sarkozy. Yeah, Sarkozy. Yeah, that's the one. Whereas at that time, Germany was starting to look better. And Merkel, in general, has looked better. She's been very strong on issues of personal dissidents and their safety. She welcomed Liu Xiaobo to Beijing. To Berlin, and was actually personally involved in getting a German doctor to go from Heidelberg to Beijing to look at Liu Xiaobo in his dying days to see if he could be saved. And she was very stiff with Xi Jinping about that. She's saying, no, we want this. We want our doctor there, and we want to bring Liu Xiaobo back if he's savable. So she was very strong on that point and got a lot of credit. But recently, too, she's been ahead of this European movement to protect the business relations between, especially Germany, but Europe in general, and China. You know, Volkswagen has come in for a lot of criticism because part of its supply chain is made in Xinjiang by what the dissidents feel is in part, if not in total, captive labor of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And there was an interview, this was a year ago or so, where the head of Volkswagen was caught having to say in a very implausible way that, no, I don't know anything about labor camps. I've never heard about this. Couldn't possibly have been true. And Merkel has come out more supportive of German business in China than the dissidents like very much. I say the dissidents here, I shouldn't do that. I'm only telling you about the impressions of the few that I'm in touch with, although I'm married to one, so that helps. But I think it would be pretty widely felt that Merkel has been ambiguous recently. Sarkozy sold things out. So it's a mixed bag. The European Union, though, as a union, has given grants to human rights groups around the world, including Chinese human rights groups.
Great, thank
Thanks,
you.
Perry. Oh, thanks for your question, King. Nice to see you. I don't want to. Well, in a way, I do want to keep you all day. I want to talk about this for another 3 or 4 hours, but we've already kept you over. And so, if there are any parting comments from any of the group, I'd like to welcome those now, and then just give you a chance for some closing thoughts, Perry.
Closing thoughts from me?
Yeah, absent anybody else jumping in. Thoughts about well, I want to note the website China File for everybody. I've done that in a couple previous notes. Thanks, Frank, from Franklin. Great talk. Thanks so much for joining us. I want to quickly note, I think China File is one of my favorite places for following issues like this. And Perry, you write there pretty regularly, as do some other some other folks that I think are important to follow.
Yeah,
but just in terms of following these developments and where things go from here, any closing remarks?
Gee, I never know what to say when people ask me about the future, because I don't have a crystal ball, don't know what to say. And also because I feel the past is so difficult to understand that I quiver at trying to talk about the future. This is a random example, but it just came across my email this morning about our country's politics and the race issue. You no doubt noticed that a few days ago, the publishers of 6 Dr. Seuss books decided to take them off the market because of Dr. Seuss's racist past. And I thought, what? I loved Dr. Seuss when I was a kid. I read it to my children. I read it to my grandchildren. That kind of whimsical sense of humor that he has seems to me so open and human and honest that I can't think of that mentality as being racist. I looked in one of his books that was withdrawn, McGilligan's Pool, which is a beautiful book, wonderful book about this little kid who dreams he's going to catch all these big fish. What could be wrong in McGilligan's Pool? And I saw some sketches of an Eskimo that looked like too much slanted eyes, and an African guy who looked a little bit too comfortable, which seemed to me a thin reed upon which to say that this otherwise very humanist writer was racist. And I remember a story he wrote called Yertle the Turtle. I don't know if anybody's come across that, but that's a beautifully written anti-authoritarian book. It's about this Yertle who wants to be the top turtle, and he oppresses everybody else and lies and steals and bosses in order to get to be the top turtle. So there you see Dr. Seuss, this Theodore Geisel, I guess his name was, being explicitly anti-authoritarian. And you see, he had a book called The Sneetches. I don't know if anybody's seen that, where one group of these duck-like things has a star on its abdomen and the other doesn't. And the ones with the stars on their abdomens lord it over the ones who don't. And it's almost a very strong metaphor against racism, saying just because you're slightly different doesn't mean you're better, but oh, we're better. And it's delightful, the whole thing. So at the conscious level, you'd have to say Dr. Seuss in those two stories anyway is anti-racist and anti-authoritarian, and he's so whimsical and humanist otherwise. How could he be racist? Just this morning, my son sent me a sketch that he did and sold to a magazine. This was when he was young, before he had started to write those books, which is just violently racist. It's horrible. It's this fat guy walking into a group of Black people who are standing there in characterized ways with a sign at the back that says, what does it say? Buy your slave now, on sale, or something like that. And it was just shocking to me. I couldn't believe I was seeing this and that it was from Dr. Seuss. So this is what I mean by I quiver to talk about the future, because here I'm 76 years old and known a lot of things and loved Dr. Seuss my whole life. I never knew that. I never remotely knew that fact about him. And now it comes and I have to crank that in to everything I know else I know about Dr. Seuss. So you'll pardon me, but I find it hard to pontificate about the future. I am very curious what will happen with the Biden administration's China team, because as I said, I think at the rhetorical level, they've been pretty good, but it's abstract. And I'm still waiting to see if they'll actually do something. I mean, the turnover of Hong Kong is heartbreaking. That just lovely, vibrant, dynamic city is now under a cloud and maybe under shackles soon. And if that happens, that's a big loss to the whole world, not just to Hong Kong people. And Tony Blinken speaks against that, yeah, but are we going to do anything to change that? I don't know.
Well, I like that. That's a nice note to end on, because now we all have to be paying attention. And so for my students who are going to be watching this later, and for everybody else, I think that's the pay attention
Okay.
and stay tuned. And this has given us a lot to think about. I really appreciate it. Oh, by the way, John Dower, I think had mentioned some tendencies of Theodore Geisel, and I also delighted in Dower, of course, who covered the Japanese,
Right.
the racial aspects of the Pacific War. But that, yeah, it's tricky. It's
What did Geyer say about Dr. I mean, what did he say about Dr.
I
Seuss?
think it was in his book, or it was either in his book or in a talk that I saw of his, and I don't want to misconstrue it now. But some notes about buy war bonds images that
Yeah.
that Geisel took part in, making certain kinds of images of the sort of stereotypical Japanese officer, in a way that was perhaps very common and acceptable for many at the time, but obviously in this part of the world led to the dehumanization of an entire group of Americans. So that was, or at least was part and parcel of that sort of stereotyping and racial subjugation that my history club students always go out and they volunteer at Manzanar, at the detention center, most springs, and so they get that from both barrels there when they go to visit that and sort of understand that which Dr. Seuss, which Theodore Geisel was a part of. But I think it's okay to have that sort of complexity.
Well, we
and
have
hopefully,
the world
yeah.
is complex. Let's face it.
There's a haste, and I'm getting to the point where I can now talk about the younger generation, and I can say, there's a haste, and of course there's always haste, as there was among radicals in the 60s, as there was, and we looked at this and in China tripping a little bit with a sort of way of thinking about Maoism and the sort of absolutism, but it is complex. It takes a longer conversation. It takes another 3 or 4 hours and another few weeks to keep getting into this. But I really appreciate your time, Perry, and
That was my pleasure.
Thanks to everybody for joining us today. And we'll continue in 2 weeks. We've got Paul Pickowitz and Carol Gluck coming in 2 weeks. And now that's very much in the news. Carol's topic of the comfort women with some people, some prominent figures holding forth about the comfort women when they have very little grounds to do so. But I'll leave it there and join us in 2 weeks for that one.
Okay, will do.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Perry. Take care.